Devil May Cry 3 is a game that's really easy to love. Even though it's almost 20 years old and there are plenty of places where it shows its age, it still feels fresh in the sense that it laid the groundwork for any crazy action title that came out after it. And not only that, I think it's better than the overwhelming majority of games developed after it. It's kind of incredible just looking at the strides made from the first 2 DMC games to this third one. The first one is great and invented the character action genre that DMC inhabits, and I won't spend too much time talking about it, but DMC 2 just isn't good, and the reason why is because it's boring. I like some of the enemy designs and there are some cool ideas at play, but its development was a mess, resulting in a not so great game. So DMC 3 was an attempt at redeeming the series, and they basically reinvented it in the process, doubling down on what made the first game great as an action title and expanding on it like nothing else. DMC 3, like the first game, is difficult, but ultimately it's a very rewarding experience. I have a younger brother who believes that in these games all you have to do is button mash to win, but that's simply not true, because if you do that you'll get killed pretty quickly. Yes, it's true that these games are frantic and fast-paced, but they expect precision and thought to be put into your button inputs. An attack too early may result in it being blocked, and a dodge a split second too late may result in death. In the middle of combat, the game requires a certain degree of thoughtfulness in stringing combos together, and you do want to string the combos together, trust me. The main reason why is that it's just fun if you can master the game well enough to style on enemies, but also you get more cash to spend on upgrades if you play stylishly, and that's one of the reasons I love this game. You're expected to get good enough to dunk on bosses, and it's no easy task. These games have an exceptionally high skill cap, and so even if, like me, you're not the best player, it's utterly captivating to watch someone who's mastered all of the mechanics of the game, and there are a lot of mechanics too. This game features 6 different styles which provide Dante with different abilities, plus 5 guns and 5 melee weapons, meaning that you can mix all of these up and get some really interesting combos. I've been playing this game for over 10 years, and that's one of the reasons why. You have so many different options that it just never gets old. Like how most of DMC 1 takes place inside an old castle, DMC 3 is mostly set in an ancient demon tower which has risen from the ground. Temen Nigru has all sorts of cool things, like giant skeleton statues around it, fiery looking launch pads, and all these doors with spikes and chains laying around. Basically, this is meant to be the tower that separates the human world from the underworld, so yeah, it's pretty spooky. You can't really expect a bounce house, can you? I love how the bulk of the game takes place in it, because it's so cool to think that all these bosses and demons are all hanging out in the same building. In my video about DMC 1, I said that the castle in that game is better at creating an atmosphere than anything else in the series, and I still feel like that's true. But still, this game's really good at creating an otherworldly atmosphere. I think one thing that's super interesting about it is the lack of background characters. In DMC 5, one of the first things you see is people out on the street, but that's not a thing at all in this one. You travel through torn up city streets in the first part of the game to get to the tower, and you even go through such well-respected establishments as a bar and a strip club, but there are no people. And I love this because it makes the game feel that much more strange and surreal. The weird has burst into the ordinary and has overcome it. Other locations include the insides of a great leviathan after Dante gets swallowed, and of course the underworld. I really love this game's interpretation of hell because parts of it are pure looking and almost look like a Twilight Zone kind of heaven, and other parts are the exact lakes of blood sort of thing you would expect. But really, these areas are really interesting to me because the underworld in DMC 1 is fleshy and organic, but here it's trippy and almost confusing at times. These kinds of white underworld areas are some of my favorite locations in any game ever. A lot of games exist solely for the gameplay and don't focus on the story at all, which is fine by me because I love Doom as much as the next guy. But this game has a pretty solid plot, which I think is easily the best in the series. The story is relatively simple. 2 brothers, each half human and half demon, fight over their family legacy, with Virgil choosing to embrace the demonic and Dante choosing to embrace his humanity. And by the end, Dante has to accept both parts of himself and he triumphs because of it. It's kind of cheesy, but it's nice. The game's main theme of choosing to embrace or reject one's heritage is tied together really nicely with the B-plot of Lady, a young human girl dealing with her father's decision to sacrifice her mother in the hopes of becoming a demon himself. I don't want to oversell the story of this game because this isn't Shakespeare we're talking about here, but at the same time I'd hate to see it dismissed just because there's a lot of jokes or because it's a game starring Dante, the wacky Wahoo pizza man. Not counting bosses, most of whom are pretty one-dimensional, there are 4 main characters: Dante, Virgil, Lady, and Arkham. Each character plays off the others really nicely, and I don't think there are really any bad pairings. Anytime any of the characters interact with each other, it's enjoyable. Dante is rightfully the star of the show because he's a playful goofball. I think that one thing people miss when talking about him is that because he is a fun and silly character, that is the reason why the game works. If he were as serious as Virgil is, then that would mean that nearly every character in the game is 100% serious, and the game would probably be seen as much more edgy and would probably be dismissed more easily because of it. After all, this is a game about demons and the underworld and human sacrifices and evil towers that rise from the ground. DMC 3 takes place in a very dark world, so if Dante weren't there to lighten things up, I think it might fall too far into grimdark territory. But at the same time, you can't have Dante only be a jokester because then you wouldn't be able to take him seriously at all, or the rest of the game for that matter. And so to combat that, they introduced a literal clown, Jester, who's a character even more absurd than Dante. By introducing a crazy character like this, they're able to make Dante wild and fun, while, by virtue of Jester's very existence, they're able to highlight his ability to be serious. They get to have their cake and eat it too, basically, and I just think it's such a brilliant move. They didn't do something like this in the first game because they didn't need to, because Dante wasn't as absurd as he is here in DMC3. I also wanted to mention my favorite thing about the game's handling of the primary antagonist, Virgil. Oftentimes in a story, you'll have the main villain, and then there will be the villain's enforcer, who's the one who actually fights the main hero. I really love how this game handles Virgil, because even though he has a lackey in the form of Arkham, Virgil is the one who does both the plotting and the fighting, and he's Dante's rival. There's no question as to who the big bad is, because it's clearly Virgil. I feel like this makes the story stronger and more pointed, and I'm glad they do it here and give you the chance to fight Virgil multiple times throughout the story. Now with that being said, the other enemies are still really cool. You have a bunch of dudes named after the 7 deadly sins who make up the bulk of the enemies you face. They're fine, but one of my favorite enemies is the Blood Goyle. I don't like fighting them because you have to shoot them then style on them, but they're cool. Most of the bosses are pretty dope too. I really like Geryon, who's a giant blue horse who can stop time. Agni and Rudra, who are 2 buff swordsmen whose heads make up the hilt of their swords, are really cool too. I really like the design for Cerberus, who's an ice-covered 3-headed dog based off the one from Greek mythology. I could ramble on about this for much longer, but suffice it to say the enemies and the bosses are really cool. There are a few I simply don't enjoy fighting, like the Fallen, who look super cool because they pose as angels, but they have these horrible faces on their torsos, but I just kind of find them annoying. Now this is a game I've been playing since middle school, so in a lot of ways it's like comfort food for me, so I'm incredibly biased in favor of it. I love this series and this game is the reason why. Like I said, this is a game that's really easy to love. It's an adrenaline rush and it does nearly everything right. It's just a great package. I read something saying that before the game came out, the developers said they'd quit Capcom if the game wasn't a huge success, and yeah, I don't blame them. If I made something this cool and wasn't recognized, I'd be mad too, but fortunately, the game was a success. It's pretty awesome. Thank you for watching.